Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow a path forward to restrict birthright citizenship. That's as a judge orders the Trump administration to reinstate thousands of probationary workers who were fired from 6 federal agencies. President Trump urging Russia to do the right thing after Putin weighs in on the ceasefire deal, and what Trump tells the NATO chief as Trump's special envoy talks with Moscow. Iris Tao at the White House. Amid rising tensions over tariffs, Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets his G7 counterparts in Canada. How the U.S. is responding to retaliatory tariffs, Jack Bradley reports. Israeli forces conduct an airstrike in Damascus, Syria. Meanwhile, UN experts accuse Israel of war crimes. How is Israel responding? Jason Perry reports. Nearly 100 pro-Palestinian protesters now arrested after storming the lobby of Trump Tower in Manhattan. We're tracking the incident. And 3 of President Trump's nominations were scheduled for consideration in the Senate, but one was abruptly withdrawn. Jason Blair has more.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow birthright citizenship restrictions to take effect in part while legal challenges play out. The president's order would deny citizenship to those born after February 19, 2025, if their parents are in the country illegally. The executive action also forbids government agencies from issuing any document or accepting any state document recognizing citizenship for such children. 3 federal appeals courts have blocked the order nationwide. Roughly 24 states have sued the Trump administration over the executive order. Plaintiffs claim the action violates the Constitution's 14th Amendment guarantee of citizenship to anyone born inside the United States. The Justice Department argues that individual judges lack the power to issue nationwide injunctions. A federal judge has ordered 6 government agencies to reinstate thousands of recently hired employees who were fired. The ruling comes amid President Trump's effort to rein in the federal workforce. The ruling by District Judge William Alsup in San Francisco applies to the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and the Treasury. Alsup temporarily blocked the Office of Personnel Management from ordering agencies to fire probationary employees last month. Trump's efforts to shrink the federal government could get scaled up shortly, though. Today marks the deadline for government agencies to submit plans for a second wave of mass layoffs and budget cuts. President Trump says his team has broken the deadlock in securing a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. It comes as he's meeting the chief of NATO at the White House as negotiations continue. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
This thing would have gone on for a long
Breaking
time.
a deadlock. It was crucial.
Yeah, we broke a deadlock.
And President Trump expresses optimism about a ceasefire as he again calls on Russia to accept a deal that Ukraine has said yes to.
Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
Thursday's meeting with the NATO chief comes as Trump's special envoy is in Moscow for talks. Russian President Putin now says he supports a ceasefire in principle, but might need to call Trump as he still holds reservations. And Trump says yes.
I'd love to meet with him or talk to him.
On the Ukraine side, Trump says his team has already gone over details with them, like what land Ukraine will and will not be able to keep, and the reality that is not joining NATO.
They've known that answer for 40 years, in all fairness.
Meanwhile, with NATO chief Mark Rutte sitting right next to him, Trump doubles down on acquiring Greenland, which is part of Denmark, a NATO member.
And we have to do it. We really need it for national security.
Secretary General Rutte, while declining to weigh in directly, supports Trump's reasoning.
When it comes to the high north and the Arctic, you are totally right. The Chinese are now using these routes. We know that the Russians are rearming.
And Greenland just elected a new government led by a pro-independence party. While Trump says that's good for the U.S., the likely new leader insists that Greenlanders must decide their own future. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
While the U.S. keeps working to close the ceasefire deal, Russia is still expressing doubts. President Vladimir Putin lays out why he thinks the truce could benefit only Kyiv and not Moscow. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pasdar has what the Kremlin is saying.
Special envoy to Russia and Ukraine Steve Witkoff is in Moscow on Thursday. The U.S. is proposing a 30-day ceasefire in the Ukraine conflict. Kyiv already accepted the proposal earlier this week. On Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said this about a possible truce.
We agree with the proposals to stop the hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this ceasefire should be such that it would lead to long-term peace and eliminate the original roots of this crisis.
Putin raised multiple concerns he has with a possible ceasefire. He says Russia is currently advancing on the battlefield, which means a pause at this moment would only help Ukraine to reorganize and deliver more weapons to the front lines. And Putin also questions who would enforce the ceasefire, saying the front line is over 1,200 miles long. One of the main reasons Putin says Russia is advancing on the battlefield is that its forces are making significant progress in the Kursk region. Russian state TV showed footage appearing to show that Russian soldiers retook a strategic town which Ukraine used to supply its troops. Putin now says his troops could soon surround the Ukrainian soldiers, preventing their escape.
There will be only two options, either to surrender or to die. In these conditions, I believe it would be good for the Ukrainian side to secure a ceasefire.
Putin says that's another point that hasn't been clarified yet. Whether those Ukrainian soldiers would be allowed to simply retreat back to Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. Putin says he'd like to have a phone call with President Trump to discuss the details of the truce. Arian Pasdar, NTD News.
And this just in, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responds to Putin's comments. Zelensky accuses Putin of planning to reject the ceasefire regardless of the conditions. The Ukrainian president says Russia is only adding conditions to the truce discussion so that it either fails or gets dragged out for as long as possible. Foreign ministers of the G7 meet in Canada during rising tensions over tariffs, taxes on imported goods. Canada and European governments are imposing retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. President Trump threatens to further increase tariffs in return. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
Tariffs, a contentious topic between the U.S. and allied nations, looms over meetings with leaders of the Group of Seven, or G7, in Canada. The foreign ministers from the U.S., Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan kicked off their first of 2 days meetings on Thursday. Mainly, the leaders are in discussions over a potential ceasefire deal in the Russia-Ukraine war and retaliatory tariffs.
In every single meeting, I will raise the issue of tariffs to coordinate our response with the Europeans and to put pressure on the Americans.
Canada is imposing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods worth $20 billion starting Thursday. The European Union, which some G7 members are on, said it will take similar actions beginning April. It was in response to President Trump imposing 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports. Trump has threatened to impose 200% tariffs on European wine and alcohol if the EU enacts its retaliatory tariffs.
Look, we've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore. No, I'm not going to bend at all. Aluminum or steel or cars. We're not going to bend.
A day before going into the G7 meetings, Rubio defended the tariffs as a national security measure.
It's not just against Canada, it's not just against Mexico, it's not just against G7 countries. He's imposed steel and aluminum tariffs now on virtually the entire world. And the reason why is not to punish those countries. It's because he has outlined the need to develop a domestic capability. If you don't have steel and aluminum, you can't build warships. You can't build airplanes. You're not an industrial economy. There are things we have to be able to protect, and there's a lot of unfair trade practices.
Canada is the biggest foreign supplier of steel and aluminum to the U.S. Meanwhile, President Trump has repeatedly called for Canada to become the 51st state.
To be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have.
The G7 meeting will conclude on Friday, where leaders will hope to make progress on ending the Russia-Ukraine war and some stability over tariffs. Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Israeli forces have reported striking a terrorist command center in the capital of Syria. Meanwhile, experts from the United Nations have accused Israel of committing genocidal acts and other war crimes. NTD's Jason Perry brings us the latest.
Israeli forces reported striking a terrorist command center in Syria's capital of Damascus on Thursday. Israel said terrorists from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organization used the site to plan terrorist activity against the state of Israel. And a member of the Islamic Jihad in Syria said the house that was hit belonged to the Secretary General of the Islamic Jihad. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave an update on the strike in Syria.
We are doing this because we have a clear policy. Whoever attacks us or plans to attack us, we attack them. And this applies not only in Syria, it applies everywhere.
Also in Damascus, on the same day, Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, signed a draft constitution which says it guarantees women's rights for education and participation in work, and also the freedom of expression and freedom of the press, among other things. Also on Thursday, United Nations experts accused Israel of committing genocidal acts and also using sexual violence as a war strategy by systematically destroying sexual and reproductive health care facilities in the Gaza Strip. Israel's government spokesperson David Mencer said those were false accusations, and he gave details of several instances of Hamas holding hostages in hospitals, as well as using hospitals for terrorist activity.
That is why our Prime Minister today has actually said that the UN's Human Rights Council is an anti-Israel circus. It's long been exposed as an anti-Semitic, rotten, terrorist-supporting and irrelevant body. That's why Israel withdrew from it. About a month ago, there has been no focus on the crimes against humanity and the war crimes committed by Hamas, by the Hamas terrorist organization.
Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, residents who recently thought they might be displaced from the territory reacted to President Trump's apparent backtrack on having residents leave the territory.
The words of U.S. President Donald Trump that no one will be expelled from the Gaza Strip, it might come from his realization, after seeing the truth, that these people are deeply rooted in their land.
And another resident complained about the Israeli blockade on the territory. NTD asked Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer if it was possible for residents to voluntarily leave the Gaza Strip. And he said they should be able to cross their border to go to their Arab brothers in Egypt to escape the war, but Egypt will not accept them. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Nearly 100 protesters have been arrested after storming the lobby of Trump Tower in Manhattan. They gathered to denounce the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a pro-Palestinian activist who's currently facing deportation by the Department of Homeland Security. The demonstration was organized by Jewish Voice for Peace, which describes itself as a progressive Jewish anti-Zionist group. The NYPD said they arrested 98 people on charges of trespassing, obstruction, and resisting arrest. Some of them were dragged out of the building in zip ties. Khalil is currently in custody at an ICE facility in Louisiana. Born and raised in Syria, he was one of the main leaders in the pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University last year. Record shows Khalil was involved in the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, an organization that came under scrutiny for its possible ties with terrorist group Hamas. The Trump administration revoked Khalil's green card on national security grounds. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump said, quote, "If you support terrorism, your presence is contrary to our national and foreign policy interests, and you are not welcome here." The Trump administration has withdrawn the nomination of Dr. Dave Weldon to head the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. NTD correspondent Jason Blair brings us an update from the nation's capital.
President Trump withdrew his nomination for CDC director. Dr. David Weldon was nominated to be head of the CDC and was scheduled to be heard in the Senate today by the Senate Health, Education, and Labor Committee. However, that committee announced this morning that that hearing was canceled. Senator Collins, who serves on that committee and was expected to most likely vote against Dr. Weldon's nomination, commented on this situation earlier today.
I had reservations about the nominee, but I wanted to give him the opportunity to answer questions in a public forum.
The Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee did go ahead with 2 other nominees today for the Trump administration, one of those being Dr. Bhattacharya to be NIH director. He did pass through the committee along party lines 12-11 with only GOP support. However, Dr. McCary did get a little bit more bipartisan support, with 2 Democrats joining Republicans, with 14-9 advancing his nomination. Here are some comments from the chair and ranking member from the hearing in the Senate.
Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. McCary have the experience and the vision to achieve President Trump's objective of making America healthy again. I support their nominations, urge my colleagues to do the same.
I will be voting against both of these nominations. In my view, we need an NIH director who is prepared to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. Unfortunately, I do not believe that President Trump's nominee to lead the NIH is that person.
Both of these nominations fall under the Department of Health and Human Services, headed by Secretary Kennedy. And the next and final stop for both of these nominees will be a full Senate vote. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Coming up, Democrat lawmakers weigh options to oppose the changes happening in the Department of Education. Luis Martinez has more from the House Democrats' annual policy retreat. Over $6 for a dozen eggs. That's the average price in the U.S. How extensively is a bird flu outbreak contributing to this, and can anything be done? Kevin Hogan takes a closer look from the Data Hub. And a rare tornado touches down in California, toppling trees and leaving many without power. Officials are now assessing the damage and working on recovery efforts. Christina Corona brings us the update from Los Angeles when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The federal workforce changes enacted by the Trump administration has been one of the main issues discussed at the House Democrats' annual policy retreat. Our Washington correspondent, Luis Martinez, has more on this story.
Just look at the split screen. People can't afford their rent. They can't afford eggs. And what is Trump doing? He is slashing the Department of Education in half, going after 180,000 teachers whose jobs depend on federal funding.
House Democrats are gathered here in Leesburg, Virginia for the second day of their annual policy retreat. And the government cuts at the Department of Education is one of the main topics of conversations. Democrats do not oppose government reform, but disagree with how President Trump is enacting change.
Well, I believe in government reform, and I believe there are a lot of places where we can find inefficiency and we can make government work better for people, and I've pushed for years on that front. But to take a sledgehammer is going to do damage that can't be repaired.
For Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, whose mom was a teacher, the Education Department is a personal issue.
First of all, it is especially helpful when it comes to student loans. And number two, people in rural areas really depend on the Department of Education for help. And then number three, kids with disabilities. Wait till those parents and those families find out about these cuts.
House Democrats are urging Senate Democrats to reject the House Republican stopgap bill to fund government. If Senate Democrats reject the bill, the government will shut down Friday at midnight.
What we do have is the power to stop a bad bill that will strip programs away from Americans.
During the policy retreat, House Democrats have promised to stand by federal workers who have lost their jobs.
Amid this chaos, Democrats have a clear message. We're fighting for and with working people.
You're going to see that unity in the weeks and the months ahead as we expose and talk about what the House Republican budget does. Our job over the next 21 months is to make sure that voters are hearing this message loud and clear, and we're going to keep repeating it over and over.
It remains to be seen what other actions House Democrats take as they oppose the Trump administration's changes to the federal workforce. Reporting from Leesburg, Virginia, Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
A coalition of Democrat-led states is challenging the Trump administration's sweeping layoffs across the education department. Plaintiffs, including 20 states and Washington, D.C., allege the firings amount to an unconstitutional dismantling of an agency created by Congress. According to a federal lawsuit filed in Massachusetts today, they allege the department can no longer function and cannot comply with its statutory requirements. The suit alleges the cuts will result in a loss or delay of federal money for public schools and will leave the agency unable to administer college financial aid or enforce civil rights laws at schools, among other disruptions. Trump has repeatedly said he wants the department shut down, arguing that the agency is wasteful. The bird flu outbreak is ravaging the egg industry. You may have noticed egg prices are sky high. Our data reporter Kevin Hogan gives us the numbers.
So many birds have perished, either being culled out of their flocks or died directly as a result of the virus. That's 166 million birds that the United States has lost. This could include turkeys, chickens for meat or eggs, snow geese, wild birds, or whether or not these chickens are in your backyard or commercial operations. That's the total number. How many of them are chickens? Well, the United States has lost 130 million chickens that lay eggs. So these are the hens or some of the males that are byproducts, but it's mostly those hens that lay those eggs. So that's part of the reason why you're seeing such sky-high egg prices. We mentioned $6 on average. That could be a lot more in other parts of the country, right? So when you look at the breakdown of the chickens first that have been lost to this virus, the egg layers make up at least more than 80% of those chickens lost. And then when you add in the other birds like turkeys and so on, you're looking at about 3/4 of all the birds that have been lost are those egg-laying chickens. Again, putting a big strain on the supply, making price pressures very high at this point. So that's what you're looking at right here, a timeline of the price of eggs, but going back from about 2019 up to the present day right here. So you can see that has just skyrocketed. It hit a peak at about $8 for a dozen eggs, and this is this grade A white eggs, but it's coming down a little bit. So let's just zoom in on this a little bit too. And first you can see that that corresponds directly with this virus. I mean, the blue is the number of birds that have been killed off, as a result, and that's 130 million that it's at right here, coming up from about 50 million for that first wave. So you look back, 2019 to 2022, the price of eggs, you probably remember. I mean, that was just about $1 or maybe just about $2. But then when you start hitting this bird flu outbreak right here in 2022, that's when you see prices start to skyrocket. I mean, you're looking at $5 for a dozen of these. And then you see that the number of birds that died, this is the cumulative total, as that levels off, prices drop relatively quickly right there. So it takes about 6 months or a year. But in about 3 months, those prices were able to come down once those waves started to, not affect the farms anymore, as much more. But then again, when you see those birds starting to die off, that's when prices go up again, right? And when you look further in time, now you go from 2024 to the present day, again, you're talking 50 million up to 130 million of those egg-laying hens dying. That's when prices just start, again, skyrocketing all the way up to 8. There is a little bit of relief in sight because, again, the chickens, the total is leveling off a little bit right now, so we're not in a big wave at the moment, and those prices have started to come down. I mean, that's $1 off. So that could, if that continues, then that could mean that there's a little bit less price pressures. Again, demand for eggs is down because think about it. If it's $6, those almonds start to look really good at that point, but the supply is way down because that's 130 million chickens that lay eggs out of the supply chain. And the United States only had about 300-something million back in 2022 to begin with, right? So the United States Department of Agriculture is doing what they can to try to combat this virus, the bird flu. So they've given about $1 billion for combating it, and 100 million of that is to study the vaccines, how that would impact the flocks and whether or not that's a viable solution. However, the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's very much opposed to that, saying that if you vaccinate with a leaky vaccine, I'll explain that, you turn those flocks into mutation factories. So a leaky vaccine is one that doesn't get the job done perfectly, and it causes the symptoms to vanish, but those birds are still carrying the virus. So that may be what he means by these mutation factories, in that you're just providing the American public with some eggs that may have some of that virus strain still in them. So they still have to do a lot of studies to find out if that's a viable solution or not. Hopefully something can be done because we want to get those eggs. Back to you.
The National Weather Service has confirmed that a tornado touched down in Southern California early this morning, causing notable damage in the area. NTD's Christina Corona tells us more from Pico Rivera.
We're here in the city of Pico Rivera, where a confirmed tornado touched down early this morning around 3:15 a.m. Right now, we're on Glen Canyon Drive, where the tornado has hit the hardest. As you can see behind me, crews are already hard at work, clearing down trees and power lines. Now, this comes as a powerful storm is sweeping through Los Angeles.
It sounded just like pretty much like a train was passing by, really loud noises. There was heavy rain as well, so you could hear everything, the intensity of it. I mean, it was really hard to sleep at night, and just waking up with all this around is pretty, concerning.
The National Weather Service confirmed that an EF0 tornado with winds up to 85 miles per hour moved through Pico Rivera and lasted approximately 2 minutes. The tornado uprooted trees and downed power lines, causing power outages in the area. It carved a mile-long path of damage, stretching about 80 yards wide at its widest point upon touching down. Tornadoes of this magnitude are rare in Southern California, making this event particularly noteworthy.
I've been living in Pico Rivera for about 25 years, basically my whole life. I've never experienced anything like this, nothing close to this. I mean, I know there was heavy rains like, everywhere else, but nothing like this at all.
Local authorities are working diligently to clear the debris and restore power to affected residents. In Riverside County, heavy rain triggered mudslides in San Jacinto on Thursday morning, covering parts of a roadway and trapping multiple vehicles. Fire officials rescued at least 6 people who were evaluated by paramedics and later released. With up to 4 inches of rain expected overnight, flash flood warnings and evacuation alerts remain in place for areas affected by the recent wildfires. Unfortunately, multiple cars have been smashed due to the downed power lines, but no injuries have been reported. High winds are forecast through the afternoon, and rain is expected in the area tomorrow. Reporting from the city of Pico Rivera, Christina Corona, NTD News.
Coming up, could peace be on the horizon between Russia and Ukraine? A foreign affairs analyst joins us to discuss Russian President Vladimir Putin's response to a U.S.-backed ceasefire plan and what we can expect next in negotiations. And in Britain, delivery of a Chinese state-run newspaper to the offices of British politicians could be stopped after a call for review. This comes days after the U.S. announced it will block delivery of China Daily into Congress. Malcolm Hudson reports from London after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. At their White House meeting today, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte commended President Trump for breaking the deadlock between Russia and Ukraine and starting up peace talks. He also credited Trump with the increased defense spending among NATO member countries. That says Russian President Vladimir Putin responded to a U.S.-backed ceasefire plan, saying he supports ending hostilities but stopped short of agreeing to the framework. Joining us now to discuss these latest developments is Larry Provost. He's a foreign affairs analyst and veteran. Larry, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here now. Putin mentioned the agreement would have to solve the root causes of the conflict. He didn't explain what those are. What do you think Putin is trying to achieve here?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. And I think it's important to know, first of all, we would not be here if it wasn't for the actions of President Trump. So that must be acknowledged first and foremost. But what Putin is trying to achieve is he's really trying to buy for time and for legitimacy. There are so many things that he wants. The list is so exhaustive. We could literally spend all night on it, vis-a-vis compared to Ukraine's, which is much, much shorter. But Putin wants no NATO membership for Ukraine, no Western peacekeepers, complete demilitarization of Ukraine, all the territories that he's had. He's indicated that he wants regime change in Ukraine as well. And he wants all Western aid halted during the ceasefire. It's a very, very long list.
Now, President Trump has called Putin's comments promising but not complete, adding that it would be, quote, very disappointing if Russia rejects the offer. How likely are we to see a ceasefire, and what would that look like?
Honestly, we don't know as far as the timing. President Trump has shown himself to be a master negotiator, and there's so much that happens behind the scenes. But what definitely will need to happen is an immense amount of pressure on Russia. And we're starting to see that through President Trump, at least in the public sense, though we know if anybody goes and visits Trump Tower, for example, they'll see private letters that the president has sent in his previous administration to leaders of other foreign nations, telling them, do not be tough guys. There are things that can be worked out, not to be stupid. So it really comes down to the amount of pressure that's going to come upon Russia and upon President Putin specifically. And as far as the ceasefire agreement goes, that's going to have different variables. That's going to have different nooks and crannies when it comes to it. But ultimately, there's going to have to be some enforcement mechanism. Otherwise, Russia is going to have incentive to do, as it has since 2014, to violate every agreement that it has.
And what do you make of Trump and Putin's history or relationship, if you will, in terms of helping to bring this war to an end?
Absolutely. Well, as I previously mentioned, President Trump is a master negotiator. He believes in the importance of personal diplomacy. He's seen where it's effective. So that relationship, what goes on in front of the cameras, but also what happens behind the cameras, is very, very effective. And I think that President Trump understands diplomacy in a way that so many other people do not. So, and we would not be where we are at today if it wasn't for his efforts. So that personal element is going to be very, very important. And he's himself has expressed that.
And as for Ukraine, the Ukrainian president's chief of staff has said Ukraine would not agree to a frozen conflict with Russia. Meanwhile, Putin said today he wants long-lasting peace. How do you see this conflict ending?
I'm sorry, screen froze for a second there. But as far as like how do we see the conflict ending and so forth, there's going to have to be an enforcement mechanism. There's going to have to be a mechanism where there is some form of troops on the ground. I don't necessarily see it being NATO. It could be a new European coalition, whether it be France and Germany, or as was mentioned previous to the minerals deal, France and the United Kingdom. It's probably not going to be NATO, but in order for the conflict to end, there's going to have to be an enforcement mechanism, and there's going to have to be concessions on both sides. Ukraine has indicated a willingness to give concessions, even territory, for the mere return of its POWs and children that have been trafficked and kidnapped by Russia. Russia has shown no willingness to give up anything thus far. So unless something new happens, which as we've seen in these past couple of weeks, anything could happen in minutes, it may be very well a long road.
Now, expanding on that, President Trump, of course, hosted NATO head Mark Rutte at the White House today. Now, both agreed European member states should pay more for their defense. Trump praised Rutte, saying, quote, NATO is stepping up through this man. We want the war ended, and he's doing his job. Now, expanding on your earlier comments, what do you see as NATO's role in ending the conflict or even post-war?
Absolutely. And this is one of the most unsung accomplishments of the previous Trump administration and now the current one, whereas President Trump has been able to dramatically get NATO partners and members to increase their defense spending. We've seen that in Poland and the Baltics and so forth, and we're seeing that increasingly in the Western NATO members. So there's an immense amount of leverage that's going to happen there with that armed force. But even if NATO itself is not going to be the peacekeeping force, the fact that there will more than likely have to be a European peacekeeping force, whether it looks like Korea or not, the fact is NATO's role is going to be important, whether they're an actual signatory to it or not, whether or not Ukraine becomes a member, which it probably will not. But NATO still has a very, very vital role in this.
Now, staying in that region, Poland's president is calling for the U.S. to station nuclear weapons in Poland as a deterrent against Russia. What do you make of that, and how likely are we to see that?
Yeah, that is a very, very interesting and very big development. And honestly, I'm not necessarily sure that we may see it under the current Trump administration. I'm not sure exactly if that's something that President Trump would necessarily want, just by indication of his previous public statements. That being said, there's nothing that stops an independent NATO partner, such as France, for example, stationing nuclear weapons upon Poland. It is important to note that Russia and NATO currently share a border, and not just in the Baltic areas, but also in Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave, where it borders North Poland and south of Lithuania, and the Russian nuclear weapons that are there. So in some ways, it may be seen as an aggressive move by Russia, but in other ways, it may just be seen as more of the same.
Well, Larry Provost, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tiffany, for having me.
Delivery of a newspaper-branded Chinese Communist Party propaganda to the offices of British politicians could be stopped after a call for review. China Daily praises China's persecution of the Uyghur people. This call for review comes days after the U.S. blocked delivery of China Daily on Capitol Hill. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more from London.
British House of Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle has called for a review over the bulk mailing of Chinese newspapers to politicians in Parliament. The newspaper China Daily is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party's Central Propaganda Department. But this newspaper is delivered to the offices of British members of Parliament every day at partial taxpayer expense without them ever asking for it. Hoyle requested an evaluation of the bulk mailing after a written question from Shadow Home Office Minister Alicia Kearns. In January, she asked the House of Commons Commission if they will ban China Daily from delivery to MPs' offices. Adding to this, Kearns now said that while Chinese diplomats may be banned from Parliament, the taxpayer is inadvertently funding Chinese Communist Party propaganda directly to politicians. She said China Daily is the only thing that arrives every day without fail, but said the newspaper should be banned as attempted foreign influence. China Daily is one of the several major state mouthpieces controlled by the CCP's Central Propaganda Department. The publication's Chinese website says its English edition, quote, actively publicizes and explains Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and that it strives to influence public opinion in favor of communist-ruled China. China Daily has praised the Chinese regime's policies against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, such as stopping women becoming what it described as baby-making machines. The Chinese regime has carried out forced abortion on Uyghur women and forced sterilization on both men and women. The former leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, said China Daily has been mailed in bulk to parliamentarians since 2016. He said it is a terrible propaganda sheet and should not be in Britain's parliament at all. It comes as the Labour Party is seeking a renewed relationship with China. Turning to the same story in the United States, on Tuesday it was announced China Daily will no longer be distributed on Capitol Hill to House offices. Representatives John Moulinar and Brian Steele said they took action to directly block the Chinese Communist Party from spreading its propaganda. The Committee on House Administration said distributor National News is currently winding down deliveries of China Daily in Congress. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
Coming up in college basketball action, Duke overcomes an injury to star player Cooper Flagg, but will they have him going forward? Dave Martin joins us to discuss. And theatergoers in Missouri experienced a cultural phenomenon. Shihuai Xinyan Performing Arts received 5 proclamations in Missouri this year after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer now for your sports news. We're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty going on today, especially in college basketball. So let's start right there. Now, Duke star Cooper Flagg was helped off the court with an apparent foot injury during today's win over Georgia Tech. What is the latest there?
Yeah, Duke head coach John Shire said it's a real long shot that he'll actually play tomorrow. He's dealing with an ankle sprain. Now, this happened in the first half. He did not return to the game. Now, how it happened, he went up really high for a rebound. As he came down, he landed on someone's foot. You could see him roll his ankle. Looked very painful. Now, he was seen in a wheelchair at halftime, taken to an x-ray room. In the second half, though, he was able to walk to the bench under his own power and without a walking boot on. Now, Duke actually trailed by 9 points when he left, but they did rely to win without him over Georgia Tech. But his availability, next week, in the NCAA tournament, that's going to be the main issue. I mean, Duke is the #1 team in the country. They're on a tear. They have a great chance of winning it all, but not without Cooper Flagg. So it appears very likely tomorrow when they play rival North Carolina, they will be without him.
Well, shifting to soccer, the Champions League is entering discussions with FIFA over a rule change because of a disallowed penalty kick Wednesday where a player appeared to double touch the ball while slipping. What is the issue here?
There's actually a couple. I mean, one is whether he actually double touched it or not. Now, you can actually judge for yourself on this replay here that we're going to show. Let's go ahead and play that right now. Now, this was in a shootout to determine which team goes to the quarterfinals. So very important. This is Julian Alvarez of Atletico Madrid. You can see he slips just before he goes to kick it. Does he actually double touch it though? It's so close to tell. Plus, it's not exactly a clear replay there either. Now they called it a double touch, disallowed the goal, which was crucial because his team ended up losing. They were not very happy about it afterwards. So now they're considering a rule change to allow a double touch when it appears to be accidental, like this one appeared to be. Of course, that's not an easy call for the referees to determine always, whether something is accidental or not. But anyway, they discussed this with FIFA as well as the International Football Association Board before making a change.
Looking at baseball news, the Tampa Bay Rays say they will not be moving into a new baseball stadium, as was previously announced. What happened to their plan?
Yeah, Hurricane Milton ripped the roof off of their stadium last October. The roof is actually made of this fiberglass-like material. This is Tropicana Field. But the roof coming off and having to replace it was only part of the problem. As you can see, the rain then came in and damaged the actual stadium as well as the winds there. It costs an estimated $55 million to repair it, but it won't even be ready then until 2026. Of course, no one wants to pay that if they're only going to use it for a couple more seasons. I mean, their new stadium was proposed to open in 2028, but they hadn't actually broken ground on that yet. So now the owner just referenced the series of events in October when saying that when talking about the stadium not actually happening. The new ballpark was going to cost $1.3 billion. The Rays were on the hook for roughly $700 million of it. Now it appears that they'll just continue with Tropicana Field for the foreseeable future.
Well, tonight in college basketball, we have 7 ranked teams in action, plus your Kansas Jayhawks. So outside of their game, what else are you looking forward to watching tonight?
Yeah, who would have thought both Kansas and Arizona would be unranked heading into this game, before the season started. But anyway, Texas Tech number 9 against Baylor. I think that should be a good game tonight. Now, Baylor had high hopes coming into the year as well. They were ranked number 8, but their only win was against a currently ranked team was over St. John's. That was like 3 months ago. It would really help their tournament resume if they can get a win over Texas Tech here. That game starts in just a few minutes, top of the hour here. I would say ditto also for unranked Oklahoma, which plays number 15 Kentucky tonight. Oklahoma started the season off 13-0. Then conference play started. They're just 7-12 since. I'll grant they're in the toughest conference in basketball, the SEC. That game actually starts at 9:30 Eastern time, and it's one of a number of games on tonight.
Well, Davis, always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
Theatergoers in Missouri experienced a cultural phenomenon. Senators and the governor gave proclamations to Shen Performing Arts. NTD is a media sponsor of Shen. NTD's David Lamb reports.
From theater to theater, Shen Performing Arts takes audience members through 5,000 years of heritage by transforming the stage. Now here at the Kauffman Center in Missouri, Shen performed from March 12th to 13th, and audience members shared their experience.
From the music, which is my first love, to the dancing and the choreography, everything was spectacular. It truly was a performance that you could tell spent hours, days, weeks planning, and I'm, to be candid, blown away that it changes every year.
Oh, it's so colorful, it's so beautiful, it's like flowers, look like a spring, really beautiful.
They're very talented. You could see that they were putting their heart into it. Everything they're putting into it.
Shen Yun received 5 proclamations in Missouri. Governor Mike Kehoe, along with senators and mayors, commended Shen Yun's mission to revive genuine traditional culture. The New York-based nonprofit was created in 2006.
The costumes were spectacular, and going back to traditional roots, some of which in fact, most of which I didn't know, the legacy or the history behind the various regions within China. I mean, going into the southwest region with the Tibet performers, it truly was, it was informative.
China was once known as the Divine Land, where its culture was divinely inspired. Shen Yun portrays that in its performance.
It's something that I admire so much from the show. Just like make me look to believe in something superior, the gods.
The divine being and bringing that to earth and then back to heaven, it was powerful.
NTD News, Kansas City, Missouri.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.